In this video I'm going to show you how you can create a mini skirt complete with a facing on the inside. So the facing is a way of finishing a waistline. It could be an armhole, a neckline or a hem, and it's a piece of fabric which sits to the inside and finishes that raw edge that you would have had at the top of the garment or on the openings. This is an example of how it could be used on a waistline, so there's no visible band across the top edge of the fabric and the facing sits on the inside. So I'll show you the techniques and how to keep it to sit flat to the inside and how to stop it from flopping around. If you're following one of my classes, you'll have been given the garment piece and the facing piece patterns to cut out. So you'll need to cut 2 on the fold in fabric of the facing and 2 on the fold in interfacing as well. And for the garment pieces, you'll need to cut 2 on the fold of these. So I've done that already. And I've got my garment pieces, 2 of them cut like so. And I've got my facing pieces, 2 of those cut. And I've applied the interfacing to the facings. On the garment pieces, the next thing I'll do is to put in the zip, and before I put in the zip I've edge finished where the zip's going to go. I'm going to apply a concealed zip to this. You'll need to get yourself a concealed zip and you'll need to shorten your zip first of all. So I've shortened my zip just so that when this goes into the side seam I've got a small seam that I can sew up at the bottom. So this is just for a sample. I'm not going to show you on this video how to apply the zip. You can see my other video on how to insert a concealed zip to follow how to do that technique. I've inserted the concealed zip here. My next stage is to make the seam on the other side. So I'll put my pieces right sides together, stitch up my seam using 1.5 cm seam allowance, and then I'll be ready to apply the facing. I've sewn the seam and then I've pressed that seam allowance open along the edge, and it is important to make sure you've pressed the seams on the skirt section before you apply the facing. Take your facing pieces next and then place these right sides together. I'm going to sew this seam then next and then edge finish and press open that seam on that side, and also edge finish these 2 shorter edges. So I'll do that next. I've made the seam in the facing, and on the wrong side I've edge finished with the overlocker and pressed that seam open, and with the 2 shorter edges I've also edge finished those. My next step is to then pin and stitch the facing to the top of my skirt. I'm going to turn the skirt so it's facing around the right way, and then I'm going to open up the zip. You can apply the facing before you put the zip in, but I find it's easier to put the facing on after I've done the zip. So take this seam and match. I'm going to be matching the shorter edge of the facing to the top edge of the skirt. So I'm going to put those 2 pieces right sides together, matching this seam here. And where I've got the seam allowances, I'm going to put in a pin either side so that when I sew those, the seam allowances will stay pressed open and flat and not sort of fold over to one side as I go over them with the sewing machine. So I place my pins like this so I can sew straight over them. Then I can just make sure that those raw edges meet along the top edge. Put in some more pins all the way along, matching those raw edges. And then when I get to the zip, so I'll just put one more in there. Because I've got a concealed zip, it needs to sit to the inside like this. Okay, so that's how it lies flat. So don't hold the zip out like this, but turn it underneath, and then you will wrap the facing over the edge like that and pin it in place. And then I'll do the same along the other side. So from my seam here, pinning these raw edges together. And then once I've got to the zip, do the same thing. So not having it laying out like this, but turning it underneath and then wrapping the facing around the zip. And if I had a centered zip or a lap zip, I would do the same thing. So wrapping the edge of the facing over the edge of the zip. And now I'm going to stitch this in place. So starting from here, sewing 1.5 centimetres in, so usual seam allowance, and just stitching that in place all the way round. So with that edge folded over like so, I'm going to start sewing 1.5 centimetres in on this fold. So keeping my raw edge in line with the 15 line on the needle plate. I can take the first pin out and then just do a few stitches forwards and back to secure, and then stitch along. Making sure those seam allowances sit flat across there. Then as I come back round to this end again, stitching over those pins, stitching over where that's folded, right to the end, and then back tacking to secure. Now I've sewn the facing on, I can take the pins out. And you'll be able to see then why it is I've done the ends of the facing in this way. So when I pull that over, it just gives me a nice finish here on that end, ready to turn to the inside. What I want to check before I go any further from the right side is that when I pull the zip up, that the facing meets across the top of the zip. So you can see there that that's perfectly lined up across here. If you find that you've got one edge that sticks up a bit higher than the other, where you can see a bit more of the garment fabric, then just open up the zip again and just turn that back over, and then just stitch a bit further down, so on the one side where it's not far enough over. So I could just come in and then just stitch a tiny section. You don't need to go all the way around, just blend that line in with the line you've got here that you've already sewn. So just stitch a few millimetres further down, stitch along, and then once you turn it back to the right side, you'll find that they meet up exactly. And it's important to do that before you do the next stage, otherwise you'll end up having to go back and undo some stitching. The facing's sitting along a curved edge, and I want to then be turning this to sit to the inside, so the facing isn't visible once the garment's finished. To do that, to make sure it sits to the inside, I need to first of all trim away some of the seam allowance that's here. If you're reading a commercial pattern when you've applied a facing, it will probably say trim, layer and clip the seam. So we'll trim first, so I'm going to trim some of the seam allowance away. So I'm cutting off maybe about 3 or 4 millimetres all the way along. And then once I've trimmed the seam, I'm going to layer it. And that means that you end up with the two seam allowances here. One will be cut slightly shorter than the other one. And I always trim the facing piece as the shorter one. So you're trimming the bit that's got the interfacing on. I'm going to use my smaller scissors for this because it's just a bit easier to get inside that line. So I'm trimming again about 2-3 millimetres away. Now if you're using lighter weight fabrics, then the layering stage isn't quite as essential as if you're using much thicker fabrics, because you don't really want to have a great big bulky line of fabric along your waist edge. I've trimmed my seam allowance, I've layered it so the facing piece is shorter than the garment one, and then I'm going to clip next. To do the clipping, you can just use the tip of the scissors and just put a snip right up to that stitch line. Or if you've got bulkier fabrics, you might want to just notch out completely small triangles like that. I've trimmed, layered and clipped, and now I'm ready to understitch. So the understitching is a line of stitching which you'll see on the inside, but you won't see it from the right side. And to help me a little bit with that first, I'm just going to do a quick bit of pressing. So I'm going to press my seam allowance towards the facing all the way along before I do anything else. So just be careful if you're ironing onto the interfacing that you've not turned your iron up too hot, because you can at this stage burn the interfacing and then you'll have to reapply it or totally redo the facing. The next stage then is the understitching. You're going to start sewing, and you're going to sew on the right side, and you'll be stitching about 2 or 3 millimeters away from the ditch of the seam that you created here. So I'll be sewing about where I've put that pin, and it will sew through the facing, and I'll catch the seam allowance on the other side, and then when that's turned to the inside you don't see that stitch line. So this is not top stitching, this is understitching. So it's only seen on the facing side and only seen inside the garment. I'm going to keep my line of stitching about here all the way along, and I want to make sure as I go I pull this flat, so the understitching must be done from the right side of the fabric. I'm pulling this over as I go to make sure it's flat. The risk of doing it from the wrong side is that you end up puckering up this side, so it really is easier to do it this way up. And you will catch the seam allowance underneath. You will be catching that as you stitch. And once I get to this end, just going right over there, right to the end, and then back tacking at that point. I've finished my line of understitching, and I've done it in a colour so that you can see where it is. So you can see that line across the fabric on the facing, and underneath it's caught the seam allowance all the way along, and then when the facing's turned to the inside it's no longer visible, and that line of stitching is completely hidden. What you need to do next is to edge finish the bottom edge of the facing. The quickest way of finishing is to use the pinking shears or the overlocker, and that can just be quickly edged. But to add a little bit of something different, you can use bias binding, although you might want to choose whether this would work for the garment that you've made, depending on how thick the fabric is and whether this might be visible or show as a ridge on the right side. So I've turned my facing the wrong way, and I've got my bias binding here, and I'm going to just open out so you can see the fold. I'm going to match the raw edges of the binding with the raw edge of the facing, and then I'll pin that in place all the way along, and then I'm going to stitch in the groove of the bias binding. So I'll pin that all the way along and then I'll stitch. Make sure that if you've got these edges here which are slightly turned under, Open them out flat before you apply the binding. I've sewn the bias binding on, stitching in the groove all the way along. Next stage is to press that over there, pressing that flat, and then turning it over to the right side of the facing. And I want to be able to cover that stitch line that I made earlier with the edge of the fold, and then I'm going to stitch it again all the way along here from the right side of the fabric. If you find you can't wrap your binding over to cover the stitch line, trim away some of this first. So I'll trim first some of this seam away and then wrap that over so that the folded edge of the binding just covers that stitch line, and then I can machine stitch that on the top. The binding's now been applied to the bottom edge of my facing, and all that's left for me to do is to just make sure that the facing will stay in place to the inside of the garment. First of all, I'm going to just iron it. So I'm going to turn it inside out. And I'm going to use a sleeve board and press this over a sleeve board because it's quite small. You'll probably find if you've made a garment that you can just press it over the ironing board. Now that's pressed to the inside, I'm going to just do a little bit of hand sewing. So where the seams meet here, that line should carry on and centre at the bottom. And I'm going to put a couple of hand stitches in the bottom here to hold that in place. And then with a needle and thread, just going to do some hand stitching between the seam allowance there, just to hold that in place. And take a stitch through the binding and hold it in place to the seam allowance on the other side there. And that will keep that inside on that seam. And then the other part, round where the zip is, making sure the facing sits flat all the way along to there, I'm going to turn this edge inside next to the zip, like so, and I'm going to pin that in place. Pinning that to the zip there, and then the same on this edge, turning that under, making sure it sits flat from that other seam all the way around. What you don't want to do is end up bunching it or pulling it so it doesn't sit flat. Turn that to the inside where the zip is, and then pin that in place. I'm going to sew in grey so you can see where I'm sewing, but you'd use a thread colour that matched. So I've tied a knot in the end, and I've got a single strand that I'm sewing with. So I'm going to bury the knot underneath there, come out just there, and I'll go through bias binding at the bottom and then back into the zip. And I'm making small stitches and taking care that they don't go all the way through to the right side. And then back into the fold there, and a small stitch along. And I'll just leave these so you can sort of see the ladder stitch that this creates as I go along. So just going through, only through the zip tape. And just check as you go along that that hasn't gone through to the right side. Back into the fold, all the way along. About a centimetre, back into the zip tape. And every time I come out, wherever I come out, so the zip tape, I go directly opposite into the fold there and along. And where I come out of the fold, I go directly opposite from there into the zip tape and then stitch a little way along. till I get all the way to the top. And if I pull on those threads, you'll see it's a pretty invisible finish. So you can see a little bit of grey, but obviously when you're doing this yourself, on your thing, you can do it in a colour that matches. So I would have used white and you wouldn't have seen the stitches. Once I've done that, you can just take a couple of stitches into the facing, tie a knot in the thread, and then just bring that back through to the right side, and then I can cut that there. Take that pin out. So that's one side secured next to the zip, and I'm going to do the same on this side. Both sides are now slip stitched in place and that's secured, and my final thing is to add a hook and eye to the top of the zip on the inside, just to keep that closed. I'm going to open the zip to do this because it'd be a lot easier. So I've threaded my needle and I'm using a double thread because I find it's quicker to sew it on in that way, and I've just tied a knot in the end. So I'm going to bury the knot inside here, and I'm stitching this on quite close to the top edge because it's the top edge I want to keep closed. I'm going to put the hook on first, and I'm stitching it quite far over there so it's sitting over the edge of the fold. I'm just going to over sew over the edges, and you can use a buttonhole stitch if you want to, but I find it's just as easy and secure with a regular over sew stitch. Now that's secured, let's take my thread through a couple of times to fasten off, and I'm going to sew on the eye part of my hook and eye. So tie another knot in the end of my thread, and I want to make sure that the eye is positioned in the right place across the other side of the zip, so when the zip's done up, like so, that's going to be sewn in. Right to the edge there and secured. So again, I'm going to bury my knot underneath there. I'm going to fasten that in place there, close to that line of stitching on my understitching, and that should be in line with the hook on the other side. I'm going to tie a knot in my thread, bring that back through, and cut that there. The facing's now been attached, and I've added a hook and eye at the top of the zip, and I've also edge finished the bottom edge of my sample. So that's my facing sample complete.